Hello, class. Today we're going to be going over Chapter 9, the nervous system. Now, the organs of the nervous system as a whole include the brain and spinal cord. I want to make a special note here. We're going to be talking about a lot of nerves, and we're going to talk about special sense organs such as the eyes, ears, microscopic organs such as those that are found on the skin. But the skin and those special sense organs are not actually part of the nervous system. The system as a whole consists of two principal divisions. So under the nervous system, you have the central nervous system, or the CNS, and then you also have the peripheral nervous system, PNS. And it's called peripheral because it's the nerves that extend to the outlying or peripheral parts of the body. And under the PNS, you have another little subdivision called the autonomic nervous system, or ANS. And the ANS consists of structures that regulates the body's automatic or involuntary functions, such as like the heart rate, contractions of the stomach intestines, and gland secretions. So in this chapter, you'll be able to list the organs and divisions of the nervous system and describe the generalized functions of the system as a whole. Identify the major types of cells in the nervous system and discuss the structure and function of each. Identify the anatomical components of a reflex arc and explain its function. Explain the mechanisms of transmission of a nerve impulse along a nerve fiber and across a synapse. Identify and discuss the major anatomical components of the brain and spinal cord and the functions of each. Identify and discuss the structure and function of the coverings and the fluid spaces of the brain and spinal cord. Compare and contrast cranial and spinal nerves. And discuss the structure and function of the two divisions of the autonomic nervous system. This PowerPoint does include a video that I will play in it, so if the volume during the video goes down or up, please adjust your volume as needed. So let's begin with the organization of the nervous system. So the central nervous system includes the brain and the spinal cord only. The peripheral nervous system, or PNS, includes all nerves. These are nerve endings that are found in the skin, but remember, skin is not part of it. The autonomic nervous system is a subdivision of the peripheral nervous system, and the autonomic nervous system is made up of structures that regulate the body's autonomic or involuntary functions, and the ANS is part of the PNS. Now let's move into the cells of the nervous system. So neurons. Neurons are the primary cells of the nervous system. The neuron structure. Each neuron consists of three main parts. You have the cell body, you have the dendrites, and you have the axon. So the cell body is that of the neuron. Then you have dendrites. These are little branching projections that conduct impulses to the cell body of the neuron. And then you have the axon, which are elongated projections that conducts impulses away from the cell body of the neuron. So dendrites, impulses to the cell body of the neuron. Axons is impulses away from the cell body of the neuron. An axon is then surrounded by a wrapping material called the myelin sheath, which speeds up nerve conduction or speeds up these messages from the brain to the body. There are nodes of Ranvier that are gaps between adjacent Schwann cells. Now, neurons are classified according to function. You have sensory, which is afferent with an A, neurons. Sensory or afferent neurons conduct impulses to the spinal cord and brain from all parts of the body. And then motor or efferent with an E neurons conduct impulses away from the brain and spinal cord to muscles and glands. Then you have interneurons, and these conduct impulses from sensory or afferent neurons to motor or efferent neurons, or are among a network of interneurons, also known as central or connecting neurons. So here you can see that neuron. You can see the cell body in the middle. You see the dendrites that kind of project off of it. Coming down, you see the axon that's covered in this myelin sheath called Schwann cells. You see that in like the little yellow orange. And that is what makes the transmission of the nerve go so fast. It can actually jump over from each Schwann cell to the next one and make nerve transmission faster. There are conditions such as multiple sclerosis in which this myelin sheath starts to degenerate and go away, and it slows the motor neurons. So they end up with a lot of nervous system issues like numbness, tingling, and then eventually a lot of times they end up with motor function as far as jerky movements and very slow movements to sometimes in multiple sclerosis they aren't able to move anymore at all. Now in image B, you can see where the receptor, the stimulus, so they poked a pin and the afferent neuron goes up to the interneuron that's there to the brain. The brain sends out efferent neuron to go down, and you've got the response to move your finger away from the needle. Moving on, let's talk about glia, also known as neuroglia. These are support cells, bringing the cells of the nervous system together structurally and functionally. There are three main types of glial cells of the central nervous system. You have astrocytes. These are star-shaped cells that anchor small blood vessels to neurons. Astrocyte branches for a two-layer structure called the blood-brain barrier, which is very important to know. This blood-brain barrier separates the blood tissue and the nervous tissue to protect the vital brain tissue from harmful chemicals that could be in our blood. Then you've got microglia. These are small cells that move in the inflamed brain tissue, carrying on phagocytosis. Gets rid of stuff that doesn't need to be there. Then you have glia, and glia is responsible for one of the most common types of brain tumors. What happens is something goes wrong and they start to overgrow. They become called a glioma. Okay, the glioma is the brain tumor. And again, gliomas are the most common type of brain tumors. And these glia that normally live in the brain before they start to like overgrow and become a tumor, they can vary in size and shape. So remember, glia are normally there, but when they start to abnormally grow into tumors, then we call them a glioma. Schwann cells, again, form the myelin sheath on the axons of the peripheral nervous system. So in this image, you can see central neuralgia and peripheral neuralgia. So you can see the astrocytes and all these just different types of cells. Now let's go more into the nerves and the tracts. So a nerve is a bundle of peripheral axons. The tract is a bundle of the central axons. It's composed of white matter, tissue composed primarily of myelinated axons or myelinated nerves or tracts. Then it also has some gray matter, which is tissue composed primarily of cell bodies and unmyelinated fibers. Nerve coverings are this fibrous connective tissue. Something called an endoneurium, which surrounds the individual fibers within a nerve. The perineurium surrounds a group or fascicle of nerve fibers. And the epineurium surrounds the entire nerve. So you can see the epineuron that's got the entire nerve, Perineuron, that's got the little fibers. Endo, which is the one axon. So you can kind of see how this is made up in there. So how do nerve signals work? Well, they work by something called reflex arcs. Nerve impulses, also called action potentials, are conducted from receptors to effectors over neuron pathways or reflex arcs. This is conduction by a reflex arc that results in a reflex, like a contraction of a muscle or secretion by a gland. A basic type of neuron pathway is called a reflex arc. It's essential to the nervous system functioning. The simplest reflex arcs are two neuron arcs, one sensory and one motor, so one afferent and one efferent, consisting of sensory neurons synapsing in the spinal cord with motor neurons. Then we have something called a three-neuron arc, and this consists of sensory neurons, afferent neurons, synapsing in the spinal cord with interneurons that then synapse with motor or efferent neurons. And you can see this in figure 9-5. So this kind of gives you an idea if on the right, when you go to the doctor and they knock you your knee with that little mallet, how it is being interpreted, right? It's going in. You can see where the sensory neuron goes in, and then you've got the motor neuron coming out. Now, in the spinal cord down here, at the bottom, you can see what's happening in there. And you can see that little interneuron in the middle. So the top one, A, is showing a 2-neuron arc. And the bottom one is showing a 3-neuron reflex arc. The 3-neuron reflex is the response that causes contraction of muscles to pull the leg away from the irritant. It's called the withdrawal reflex. So let's talk a little more about our nerve impulse itself. So the definition of a nerve impulse is a self-propagating wave of electrical disturbance that travels along the surface of a neuron membrane, also called action potential. The mechanism of the nerve impulse: at rest, the neuron's membrane is slightly positive on the outside, polarized from a slight excess of sodium ions on the outside. And you'll notice sodium is abbreviated as a capital N, small a, and a plus sign. The stimulus triggers the opening of the sodium channels in the plasma membrane of the neuron. Then the inward movement of sodium depolarizes the membrane by making the inside more positive than the outside at the stimulated point. This depolarization is a nerve impulse or action potential. Now, the stimulated section of membrane immediately repolarizes, but by that time, the depolarization has already triggered the next section of membrane to depolarize, thus propagating a wave of electrical disturbances or depolarizations all the way down the membrane. So synapses, a synapse is where impulses are transmitted from one neuron to another, a postsynaptic neuron. And you can actually see this in figure 9-8. The synapse is made of three structures: the synaptic knob, the synaptic cleft, and the plasma membrane. There are neurotransmitters at the synapse that bind to specific receptor molecules in the membrane of a postsynaptic neuron, opening ion channels and thereby stimulating impulse conduction by the membrane. So I always think of neurotransmitters as little chemical helpers. So Let's go ahead and watch this video that explains nerve
The nerve
impulse.
impulse is an electrical signal that conveys information along a neuron. The series of events that causes the electrical charge inside a nerve cell to convey information and go from a resting state to a depolarized state and back to a resting state is known as the action potential or nerve impulse. We begin with the resting or polarization phase. In this state, the chief intracellular ions include the positively charged potassium ions, K+, and several negatively charged ions or anions. During the resting state, the potassium ions tend to leak out of the cell. When they do, they take the positive charge with them, resulting in a negative environment within the cell. When the neuron is stimulated, the membrane becomes permeable to sodium and allows sodium ions, Na+, to cross over the membrane into the cell. This increase in sodium with the diffusion of positive charges changes the inside of the cell, making it now a positive environment. This is depolarization. After the impulse has passed through, the cell membrane again changes. It no longer allows the diffusion of sodium into the cell. In fact, the sodium begins to be removed by pumps located within the membrane of the neuron. It also allows potassium to once again diffuse out of the cell. This outward movement of the positively charged potassium ions removes the positive charge from the inside of the cell and leaves behind the negatively charged ions, which causes repolarization. If the traveling impulse encounters a section of membrane covered with myelin, it jumps around the myelin. This type of impulse travel is much faster than is possible in non-myelinated sections and is known as saltatory conduction.
Okay, so remember, the impulse or action potential can't go backward during the brief repolarization and the recovery of the previous membrane. Thus, it travels continuously in one direction. If the traveling impulse encounters a section of membrane covered with insulating myelin, it simply jumps around the myelin from the node of Ranvier, which is a gap, to the next. This is called saltatory conduction, and it makes the nerve impulse faster than when encountering non-myelinated sections. Now let's discuss these neurotransmitters a little bit more. So neurotransmitters are these little helper chemicals. They are chemicals by which neurons communicate. We have acetylcholine, ACH, which we've talked about before. Then we have our catecholines or catecholamines. These are norepinephrine, dopamine, and serotonin. There's only 3, and they make up the amines, AMINES group of neurotransmitters. Then we have endorphins, we have enkephalins, and we have nitric oxide. And there are some other compounds that we don't really talk about much. Now, neurotransmitters are not distributed randomly through the spinal cord and brain. They have specific sites that they work on. That's why there's certain neurotransmitters that are associated with certain diseases and conditions. Neurotransmitters are extremely important. So, presynaptic neurons release these neurotransmitters that assist, stimulate, or inhibit, which stop postsynaptic neurons. Specific neurotransmitters are localized in distinct groups of neurons and released in specific pathways. Acetylcholine, or ACH, is released at some synapses in the spinal cord and the neuromuscular or the nerve muscle junctions that we've talked about. Then you have your three amines, which are norepinephrine, dopamine, and serotonin. These affect sleep, motor function, mood, and pleasure recognition. Then you have your endorphins and enkephalins, which are released at various spinal cord and brain synapses in the pain conduction pathways. So this here shows the components of a synapse. So the number one, the action potential conducted along the axon reaches the axon knob, the synaptic knob. Then this action potential triggers the release of neurotransmitters from little vesicles in there. The vesicles are little, round things that kind of carry the neurotransmitters. Then the neurotransmitters will go across the synaptic cleft and bind to the postsynaptic receptors on the membrane. And the activated receptors trigger the opening of ion channels that initiate a postsynaptic impulse, depending on if it's pain and it's an endorphin neurotransmitter or if it's dopamine, serotonin. So again, they're not all just thrown out there at one time. There's specific ones that are being released depending on what the body is doing. Is it trying to go to sleep? Did you stub your toe? Things like that. So what happens after? After impulse conduction by the postsynaptic knobs, neurons is initiated. Neurotransmitter activity is rapidly terminated, and either one or both mechanisms cause this, either reuptake of the neurotransmitter or enzymes that break down the neurotransmitter. So reuptake is when some neurotransmitter molecules are transported out of the synaptic cleft back into the synaptic knob. So it just sucks it back up into the knob. Enzyme breakdown is when enzymes break the neurotransmitters apart and the leftover pieces are returned to the presynaptic neuron to be recycled into new neurotransmitters. Now let's go into our central nervous system. I know your brains are probably ready to explode, but we're going to keep going. You can do this. So, divisions of the brain. We have the brainstem, and in the brainstem, we have the medulla oblongata, the pons, and the midbrain. That makes up the brain stem. The cerebellum. Then we have the diencephalon, which contains the hypothalamus, thalamus, and the pineal gland. Then we have the cerebrum. We also have the spinal cord. We have coverings and fluid spaces. And we have the brain and the spinal cord that are protected by three membranes called meninges. So all of this makes up the central nervous system. So this shows major regions of the central nervous system. So if you'll notice here, you can see the orange, that is the cerebral cortex. Purple, we've got the thalamus, and right below that is the hypothalamus. Think of lower. The blue section, this is the cerebellum. At the very top there, little teeny tiny light purple is the pineal gland. Then you can see down in the green, this is the pons. The pink reticular formation that makes up the medulla. You can see the spinal cord. So this is in the pituitary gland that's right there back behind the nose. So you can kind of see where all of these areas are within the actual brain. And then the yellow is where the spinal cord starts and goes down into the spinal canal. So the brainstem, again, the brainstem consists of three parts: medulla oblongata, pons, and the midbrain. Now, the structure of this is white matter mixed with little bits of gray matter kind of scattered throughout it. And the functions is so important. So all three parts of the brainstem conduct impulses to the higher parts of the brain. So if the brain system or brainstem, like say the brainstem, you get a head injury and there's too much pressure and the brainstem goes down towards the spinal canal, you can't live like that because it disrupts the communication with all the other higher parts of the brain. Next, let's talk about the cerebellum. This is the second largest part of the human brain. It's mostly gray matter, outer layer that is thin and highly folded, forming a large surface area for processing information. We have the arbor vitae, which is in the cerebellum. This is an internal tree-like network of white matter tracts. So the functions of the cerebellum is very important. So the cerebellum helps control muscle contractions to produce coordinated, smooth movements, maintaining balance, moving around smoothly, or sustaining normal postures. So if there's any damage to the cerebellum, you're going to have abnormal postures, you're going to have uncoordinated movements, balance issues, and there's a variety of additional coordinating effects that the cerebellum has that assist the cerebrum and other regions of the brain. Now we have the diencephalon. This is a small but mighty guy right here. It contains the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus lies just below the thalamus. It consists mostly of posterior pituitary gland, pituitary stalk, and gray matter. The hypothalamus acts as the major center for controlling the autonomic nervous system. Therefore, it helps control the functioning of most internal organs. Hypothalamus functions as an endocrine or ductless gland, and it controls hormone secretion by the anterior and posterior pituitary glands. Therefore, it indirectly helps control hormone secretion by most other endocrine glands. It contains centers for controlling body temperature, appetite, wakefulness, and pleasure. It indirectly helps control the functioning of every cell in our body. Now, the other part of the diencephalon is the thalamus, and this is the dumbbell-shaped mass that's on top of the hypothalamus. It consists of gray matter extending towards each cerebral hemisphere. Hemisphere is two different sides, left and right. It relays sensory impulses to the cerebral cortex sensory areas, and in some way produces the emotions of pleasantness or unpleasantness associated with sensations. So basically, the thalamus you can think of it, it associates sensations with emotions. It regulates the level of consciousness, keeps us aroused, aka awake, and it participates in motor reflexes, more complex reflex movements. Now, the pineal gland, or pineal body, is a small body resembling a little pine nut behind the thalamus. It adjusts the output of what's called our time-keeping hormone. Our time-keeping hormone is melatonin, and melatonin gets adjusted in response to changing levels of external light, sunlight, moonlight, even artificial light. The pineal gland receives sensory information about the strength of light and adjusts its output of melatonin. It is the body's internal time clock. So, the pineal gland is the internal body's time clock because of this melatonin. So, basically, if you think of it, when you wake up in the morning, if you turn on lights, or you go outside, it actually will wake you up faster, right? If you leave the lights low, the melatonin is going to keep secreting in the same amount. You're going to have a harder time truly waking up. Same thing at night. What do we say about good sleeping habits? Stay away from social media, dim the lights, turn them off, work on breathing, because as the lights go off, melatonin gets secreted to help keep you asleep. We actually give melatonin supplements, and some of you might take melatonin at bedtime to actually help you sleep. Next is the cerebrum. And there are common disorders that's associated with problems in the cerebrum. Some that you may have heard of is Parkinson's disease or cerebrovascular accident, which is a CVA, also known as a stroke. The cerebrum is the largest part of the human brain. It has ridges called convolutions or gyri, and grooves called sulci. So convolutions or ridges called gyri and grooves called sulci. The outer layers of gray matter are the cerebral cortex, made up of lobes, composed mainly of dendrites and cell bodies of neurons. The interior of the cerebrum is composed mainly of white matter. And the interior of the cerebrum has these tracts of nerve fibers arranged in bundles. And it also contains the basal nuclei or the basal ganglia. Now, the basal nuclei, also known as the basal ganglia, are little islands of gray matter that regulate automatic movements and posture. So that is important. Now, functions of the cerebrum is mental processes of all types, including sensations, consciousness, memory, and voluntary control of movements. So here you can see the cerebrum, and you'll see where I have some things highlighted in different colors. So if you look to the left on image A, you'll see in pink I have frontal lobe highlighted. And if you look at the right image, the frontal lobe is associated with conscious thought and the Broca area, which is the motor speech area. So conscious thought and Broca area, which is our speech area, that is all located in this frontal lobe. Now, if you go below that and look where I highlighted on the left, the temporal lobe. The temporal lobe is towards the bottom of the brain, back by the cerebellum. You see the little cerebellum underneath it. The temporal lobe is associated with the auditory association area and the primary auditory. So this is where our hearing comes from, is right here. The temporal lobe is associated with hearing. Now, if you look back over here at the occipital lobe, you'll notice that this is our vision area. So visual association, visual cortex. So damage to the occipital lobe can actually cause vision issues. Now, going up, I do not have it highlighted, but the parietal lobe, that is in that rose colored on the left, that is where we get like body sense perception, or proprioception is what we call it, taste area. All of that is going to be located more in the parietal lobe. We also will have the Wernicke's area in the parietal lobe. This is a sensory speech area. It's not the motor. It's not the movements of speech. It's more of a sensing speech, of identifying and recognizing speech. Now let's move on to the spinal cord. Spinal cord consists of columns of white matter composed of bundles of myelinated nerve fibers that form the outer portion of the H-shaped core of the spinal cord. There's bundles of axons called tracts. The inner part is composed of gray matter made up mainly of neuron dendrites and cell bodies. The spinal cord tracts provide two-way conduction paths, ascending, which goes up towards the brain, and descending, which goes down towards the peripheral system, the periphery. The spinal cord functions as the primary center for all spinal cord reflexes. So all of the spinal cord reflexes come through the spinal cord because it is the primary center. Sensory tracts conduct impulses to the brain, and motor tracts conduct impulses from the brain. Now, the spinal cord, I want to make a note here. If an injury cuts the spinal cord all the way across, impulses can no longer travel to the brain from any part of the body located below the injury. And this is what causes paralysis associated with either cervical spine, thoracic, or lumbar spine spinal cord damage, where it gets severed across, usually by trauma. So here, I want you to notice you have an image of the spinal cord and spinal nerves. And of this, remember, in your cervical vertebrae, you have 7. Then you have 12 in your thoracic, and you have 5 in your lumbar. and you have one sacrum. And this is just a good image. You don't have to label it, but it's a good image so that you can get an idea of how the nerves come off of the actual spinal cord and go through in between the vertebrae and go out towards the periphery of the body. Now let's talk about coverings and fluid spaces of the brain and spinal cord. The coverings, these are cranial bones and vertebrae. And then we have the meninges. We have cerebral and spinal meninges. The meninges have 3 different layers. You have the dura mater, which is the tough outer layer. You have the pia mater, which is the innermost membrane covering the spinal cord itself. And then you have the arachnoid mater. This is the membrane between the dura and the pia mater. These meninges form the protective covering around the spinal cord, and you must know them. Incidentally, the dura mater, pia mater, and arachnoid mater also surround the brain itself. Now, fluid spaces. You have a subarachnoid spaces of the meninges. You have central canal inside the cord, and then you have 4 ventricles within the brain that all contain fluid. And that is cerebrospinal fluid, CSF. So this shows the spinal cord and its coverings. So in the middle, you see the gray matter, a little bit of white matter. You see all of the spinal nerves coming off. And then you can see that pia mater that's wrapped around. The arachnoid mater that's on top of the pia mater, and below the dura mater, because the dura mater is the outside covering. Pia mater innermost covering, dura mater outside, and the arachnoid is in between. Now let's go into the peripheral nervous system some more. So cranial nerves, you have 12 pairs of cranial nerves. 12 pairs of cranial nerves. These are attached to the undersurface of the brain. They connect the brain with the neck and structures in the thorax and abdomen. Then you have our spinal nerves. In the spine, you have 31 pairs that contain dendrites of sensory neurons and axons of motor neurons. The spinal nerves conduct impulses necessary for sensations and voluntary movements. And then you also have dermatomes, and these are skin surface areas supplied by a single cranial or spinal nerve. Now, these are the cranial nerves that are at the base of the brain. You do not have to know every single one of them right now, but you will have to, in the nursing program, learn these. So there are 12 pairs of cranial nerve. Now, if you look in the middle and you go up to the right, you'll see CN1, or olfactory nerve. That is the nerve that gives us sense of smell. Then you'll see they don't go in order, if you notice. Next, we have trigeminal nerve that innervates the side of the face, and that is associated with something called trigeminal neuralgia that we'll study in the future. Then you have your glossopharyngeal nerve here, and that is cranial nerve 9, and that moves your tongue, along with the hypoglossal nerve. Then you can see the accessory nerve, which helps to move your shoulder, neck area. Moving left, you'll see the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve goes all the way from the brain all the way to the rectum. And we talk about vasovagal response in the future in nursing, and this vagus nerve is part of that. Then you've got your vestibulocochlear nerve here, which is cranial nerve 8, and that helps with sensation of equilibrium. Then above that is your facial nerve, and that innervates the face. That's how you can feel things. Then you see your abducen nerve. Your abducen nerve is part of eye movements. Then you have your oculomotor nerve and your optic nerve, which again, part of eye movements and pupillary response. And then it finishes with the trochlear nerve, which goes down. So again, we study these more in the future. I do not expect you to memorize them all now, but you need to remember that you have 12 pairs of cranial nerves. So the autonomic nervous system. So There's the functional anatomy part, there's the autonomic nervous system or conduction pathways. We're going to talk about the sympathetic division, the parasympathetic division, autonomic neurotransmitters, and the autonomic nervous system as a whole. So, functional anatomy. This consists of motor neurons that conduct impulses from the central nervous system to cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glandular epithelial tissue. It regulates the body's automatic or involuntary functions. This happens at the preganglionic autonomic neurons. These conduct impulses from the spinal cord or brainstem to an autonomic ganglion. The postganglionic neurons then conduct from the autonomic ganglia to cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glandular epithelial tissue. And then it triggers autonomic or visceral effectors. These are tissues to which the autonomic neurons conduct the impulses. And then we end up with either sympathetic or a parasympathetic system response. Stay with me. So here you can see the innervation of major target organs by the autonomic nervous system. So when we talk about the ANS, we are talking about either sympathetic system, which is the fight or flight system, and we have the parasympathetic, which is the rest and digest. So let's first look over here in the lighter orange. Sympathetic nervous system response. This is the fight or flight. This is where your pupils dilate. You start secreting saliva, or maybe you get dried up. You get overly excited. Bronchioles dilate. Your heart rate speeds up. You secrete adrenaline. You decrease your gastric acid in your stomach. Decreased intestinal motility. You don't have a bowel movement. Your urine, you have a delay in emptying your bladder, because the sympathetic is that fight or flight, like overly adrenalized response. We do not normally live in our sympathetic nervous system as primary. We would be exhausted if we did. Our typical everyday, unless you get like startled or you get super excited or you're an adrenaline junkie going in fast cars, doing something to stimulate the sympathetic nervous system, you're usually day to day in the parasympathetic mode. This constricts bronchioles, slows down our heartbeat and keeps it between 60 and 100 beats per minute. Increases secretion of stomach acid to help you digest your food. It increases motility, that movement of your food in your small intestine that goes into your large intestine, goes down into your colon. You eventually have a bowel movement. It also is what's in charge when you need to empty your bladder. So this is all our normal parasympathetic rest and digest. And that is what we live in most of our day. So the autonomic conduction pathway. So this consists of two neuron relays. We have a preganglionic neurons from the CNS to autonomic ganglia, synapses, postganglionic neurons from ganglia to visceral effectors. So in contrast, somatic motor neurons conduct all the way from the central nervous system to somatic effectors with no intervening synapses. So the sympathetic division is also known as the thoracolumbar system. Thoracolumbar system, sympathetic. The structure, it's made up of dendrites and cell bodies, is sympathetic preganglionic neurons that are located in the gray matter of the thoracic and upper lumbar segments of the spinal cord. Axons leave the spinal cord to the anterior roots of spinal nerves, extend to sympathetic or collateral ganglia, and synapse with several postganglionic neurons whose axons extend to spinal or autonomic nerves that terminate in visceral effectors. A chain of sympathetic ganglia is in front of and at each side of the spinal column. So we really need to know more about the function, right? So the sympathetic division serves as the emergency or stress system, controlling visceral effectors during strenuous exercise and when strong emotions such as anger, fear, hate, or anxiety are triggered. The group of changes induced by the sympathetic control is called the fight or flight response. Now, the parasympathetic division, known as the craniosacral system, its structure, it has parasympathetic preganglionic neurons. They have dendrites and cell bodies in the gray matter of the brainstem and the sacral segments of the spinal cord. They terminate or end in the parasympathetic ganglia located in the head and in the thoracic and abdominal cavities close to visceral effectors. Each parasympathetic preganglionic neuron synapses with postganglionic neurons to only one effector. Again, important part here is the function. The parasympathetic division dominates control of many visceral effectors under normal everyday condition. It counterbalances the sympathetic function, and it functions some distance away from the spinal cord. Again, it's the rest and digest part of the parasympathetic system. Now let's talk about autonomic neurotransmitters. So the neurotransmitters in the ANS consist mostly of cholinergic fibers. These are preganglionic axons of the parasympathetic and the sympathetic systems, and parasympathetic postganglionic axons release acetylcholine, ACH. Now, adrenergic fibers, these are axons of the sympathetic postganglionic neurons, and they release norepinephrine or noradrenaline. The term autonomic nervous system implies this part of the nervous system is independent from other parts, but that is not true. The autonomic nervous system regulates the body's automatic functions in ways that maintain or quickly restore homeostasis. There are many visceral effectors that are doubly innervated. In other words, they receive fibers from the parasympathetic and the sympathetic divisions and are influenced in opposite ways by the two divisions. So remember earlier when I talked about sympathetic or adrenaline response, it slows down your stomach acid. Well, if your parasympathetic division, your normal everyday Western digestive, takes over, it will actually increase the secretions of the stomach to start digesting again. That's an example of how they are receiving fibers, the stomach's receiving fibers from both parasympathetic and sympathetic division. So do your intestines and bladder and whatnot. Now, the limbic system in the brain is also known as the emotional brain, right? We really associate limbic system with emotions. And according to some physiologists, the slightly altered state of consciousness known as meditation leads to decreased sympathetic nervous system activity and a group of changes opposite to those are fight or flight response. So they can actually help you with the rest and the digesting of your body system. And that is, I'm sure you're very thankful, the end of chapter 9. Happy studying, and I will be speaking with you in the next one.